Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to the Philosophy of Art and Science. As always, if you support these videos, you can subscribe directly on YouTube and join the channel for even $1 a month, or you can head over to patreon.com/tawahdo, patreon.com/TEWAHIDO. I am joined today by Charles Haywood of the Worthy House. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, of course. Just so the audience knows, I know you know already, I listened to a very delightful podcast episode from the American Mind between Charles and Michael Anton. And it was a deep discussion on the finer points and the benefits, the pros and cons of Republican form of governance versus Caesarism or Augustinism, which is, I think, a modified form of the monarchy that a lot of my audience would be familiar with. In Ethiopia, we never really had need for a Caesar because we never had a republic. We had communism for 10 or so years, and from the 70s actually to the early 90s. And then since, we've experimented with what we've called a federal democracy, but like many other places in Africa and in fact in East Asia, the more of those words you stick in, the less authentic it is. But any kind of a post facto ideas or thoughts or reflections on that and the response to that episode, I encourage everyone to go listen to it. So I don't want to rehash it here.
Yes, so I run a blog, but the podcast was an American Mind podcast, which is a publication of the Claremont Institute, which I recommend to all and sundry. A lot of the publications are extremely interesting. I don't get any commission for saying that. It's simply a plug for people I think are doing a lot of interesting things nowadays in a time when interesting things are called for. So the response to the podcast episode, which kind of went all over, it was basically Anton and me talking about whatever was on our mind, though it definitely focused on the issues and topics that you mentioned. The response has been very gratifying. There was apparently a lot of listenership. I've gotten a lot of people contacting me as a result. I think that speaks to the desire for people to talk about something that's new, or perhaps that's old and is to be new again. So people are dissatisfied with a lot of the bromides that they're offered, and I think that's why a lot of different podcasts and writings and other things out there are getting traction in a way that they might not have otherwise. I don't mean to overstate that anything that Anton and I said was particularly original or unique, and we're not going to get any Bitcoin tips or anything like that out of it. It was merely mostly academic. Neither of us is calling for followers, for pitchforks to repeat the as I like to call it, the 2021 electoral justice protest in Washington. But so it's mostly academic, but I think it was interesting, and the response was very gratifying.
Yeah, that's right. Two things on that. I've heard many different situations all over the world. One of the ones that Curtis Yarvin, a former guest on this program, had pointed to was in Egypt. There was this Tahrir Square revolution, part of the larger quote unquote Arab Spring. And one of the ways that culminated was by everybody kind of sending a text to the military saying something to the effect of, I think, a yes or no vote of, hey, I think the revolution is over. And so things kind of rapidly changed. So it's interesting based off of the readership, the audience, the people hearing it, you get kind of an informal polling of, like you said, how many people would vibe with those ideas without, calling for anything necessarily real world now, but, just like gathering a poll, almost like you're social scientists in that regard. Mm-hmm. Another aspect of that's fascinating is, like you said, it was free form. It wasn't directed, but you touched right now on one of the ideas that, again, we've talked about here. Some people have used the term archaeofuturism. I've done that with throwing the prefix Afro-Asiatic in my own blog, because it's the name of the language families of the Semitic and Cushitic languages, which dominate the Horn of Africa and a lot of the people I'm related to. But this idea of the future and the past it's in the subtitle of The Worthy House as well. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean about the future and the past?
Well, I hope you have a couple hours, so we'll try to keep it brief. But generally speaking, my philosophy revolves around the idea, or a couple of ideas, but the basic idea is we live in a clown society, whether that's in a global clown society. Different aspects of that manifest themselves differently in different places. So, for example, I know relatively little about China, and China may or may not be a clown society. That's not really my focus. And I know quite little about the Horn of Africa, bits and pieces. I've read a couple of books, as you know, and so on. But I would never presume to talk about the politics or the past or the future of the Horn of Africa. That said, the rest of the world is certainly a clown society. And a clown society cannot continue. Well, I could spend hours breaking down why that is, but there's no chance whatsoever that what we see around us is going to be around in 100 years, and extremely little chance he'll be around in 15 years. So necessarily that means something else will replace it. There may all of us sitting around burning old newspapers in trash barrels and eating rats, but hopefully not. Hopefully something, nature abhors a vacuum. No one will put up with anarchy. People who think that we're all going to go to some Mad Max society where everyone's shooting everybody all day long don't understand any history. People won't abide anarchy. They just won't. I mean, they'll always gravitate to something that will replace anarchy. And so we're all conditioned to believe that the things we see around us are natural. It's like the old joke about the fish asking the other fish, how's the water? And the other fish says, what's water? Because that's what they're swimming in, right? And so we're all conditioned to believe that the principles that drive, broadly speaking, Western society now are natural, immutable, inexorable, and will go on forever, because this is what we're instructed by my enemies, to put it bluntly, is the way things are. So that's not the way things are. So it has to be replaced at some point. It's going to be replaced because this is fundamentally anti-reality and can't continue, unless I'm completely wrong, in which case, well, that's unfortunate. But assuming I'm not completely wrong, it has to be replaced by something, which necessarily is going to be something not entirely new, because history, if for people who read history nowadays, which is relatively few, gives us all sorts of lessons that we can apply to the future. So what we don't want is we don't want to go back to 1620. We don't want to restore, the Duke of Liechtenstein as the rightful descendant of the Jacobites. Jacobites, yeah, not Jacobins, Jacobites.
No.
With all due respect to Curtis Yarvin, his idea that we should, which I think is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that we should restore the Jacobite monarchy doesn't really work. We need to have something new, informed by the wisdom of the past. And so, in a nutshell, a 3-minute nutshell or 5-minute or whatever that was, we have to study the past and the actual lessons of that, by which I basically mean the pre-Enlightenment past. Pretty much 95% of the Enlightenment is worthless and should be thrown out the window, and we should study what was done and successful in the past and apply that to our current situation, which is very different from 1750, obviously, most notably in terms of technology and other things which we have to manage appropriately. But the tools that people have developed over the past, say, 3,000 years are still there for us to pick up and use. And so that's what we're going to do.
That sounds beautiful, and it sounds like we have similar enemies. I think for shorthand, people would say the Fukuyamans. I used to participate in a very hyper progressive world of university debate, which has progressed or regressed, whichever way you're looking at that.
Mm-hmm.
As I've left, it used to be super policy oriented, and people began abandoning discourse on policies and started literally doing theatrics, or what they call, theory. And so what is spreading now in the theory debates, I saw it play out in literal policy positions that people would have arguments and discussions about, meta arguments that we shouldn't even have arguments, but instead that the person should just tell you everything about their life story or their life events. And this blending of the future and the past is interesting. And last word on Curtis. In fairness to him, he presents the restoration of the House of Stuarts as one model, but he presents, many others. one, for example, that I push on Twitter, kind of tongue in cheek sometimes, is render all executive power to Clarence Thomas. It's a true compromise. You get a black Catholic king of America, which would be
I
very
would be
hilarious.
just fine with that. I think we can implement that. Of course, the problem with that is that Thomas is he must be well into his 70s now.
He's up there.
So it's never good to pick an old person as your new king, because then you have the succession problem. And
that's right.
No
I have heard that he's molded some of his clerks in his own image, and I know you have a background in lawyering as well.
I know a couple of his clerks, and so I can't tell you whether that's overall accurate, but certainly the ones I know, that's accurate.
Yeah, that's accurate. So if it's following at least the looser Roman system of adoption, in which the original word genuine or genuine is someone that you mark to be your successor, whether they be blood related or not. You place them. The Roman patrician places them on their knee and says, "You are genuine. You are mine. You are my successor. Here's my inheritance." So perhaps he could do something like that.
I did not know that was the origin, though I'm familiar with the process. Sure. As you know, I see a lot of benefit in studying the Roman switch from republic to empire. And so I'm all for adopting appropriate Roman customs. Not all of them. I mean, I object to certain aspects of the Roman psyche, and in general to pre-Christian psyches, which tended to have characteristics which are very bad from my perspective. So I wouldn't adopt the Roman system wholesale, but from a political organizational structure, they had a lot to offer.
That's fair. I see a lot of what Tom Holland, the historian, is one of the historians of Rome, has been saying a lot lately, and he's more generally atheist in the past, I think more agnostic now, and leaning more and more to at least an appreciation of the Christian culture writ large. And he says a large part of that is seeing the kind of barbarism that was capable. Obviously the Romans used the word barbarism to talk about the Visigoths and the other Germanic tribes, but even within the kind of Roman system, to at least the modern point of view, there's some things that assault even people who could appreciate that form of government. It assaults some of our predilections. And he said seeing that actually made him more open-minded to Christianity, because it made him understand that some of his values that are deep within him, even if he was not, metaphysically there, kind of like a Jordan Peterson character, if he doesn't accept the metaphysics, there are some parts of the ethics that are so ingrained in him, he doesn't know how to like root that out, like some of the more American transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau, I think, tried to do.
Well, I have a couple Holland books, and I have Dominion, but haven't read it yet, which I believe is his most recent book. The book I'd actually recommend on that specific topic, which I don't have a review of because it's about 10 years old, is by a woman named Sarah Rudin, who wrote a book maybe 11 years ago called Paul Among the People, which is an exploration of St. Paul's effect as it would have been seen by the Romans themselves. And so her point, she's a liberal theologian, so I certainly don't resonate with her on that way. And she's a translator. She's also translated Augustine's Confessions and some other stuff very well. But her point is that the St. Paul's message was not just radical in the sense that we see it as radical, because we see it as somewhat radical because it tells us to do stuff that is not something that we do easily necessarily, but within the cultural milieu of the Roman and Greco-Roman world was truly radical in the sense that and she relates that to particular his focus on sexual immorality, for example, and then talks about the various practices of the Romans that we would regard as bizarrely unpleasant and hateful, and a wide variety of things that have just disappeared because, as Holland says, Christianity is kind of the baseline of what we do. The thing I always remember from her book is the Romans, and I think this is in Horace, recommending the creation of a love potion by starving a child to death by burying the child up to his head, and in view of a rich plate of foods, and then having the child starve to death, and then using that because his desires would be so great that we could then take. So that kind of, now, I don't know how often the Romans did that, but the fact you could even recommend that says something about your culture and not good. So,
We don't like
again,
the FDA, but not FDA approved.
right, exactly, very much. And so I don't think the Romans are exemplars of all kinds of virtues, but nonetheless, back to the politics, I think they political structure wise, they have something to say.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I want to carry a certain line of thinking back to that kind of transition from republic to Caesarism. But before, you obviously have this deep passion for history and for reading in general, and not just reading, but you've also recorded audio versions of all of your reviews to give people access in either audio format or reading format. What was it that allowed you to make this transition from lawyering to manufacturing to book reviewing? Were you doing some of these things at the same time, or were there like clean different moments and stages of your life?
Well, you've touched on my favorite topic, which is me. So I'll try not to take up too much of everyone's time discussing my own life, because I'll go off on meandering anecdotes and it'll start to get boring. But in
I
short,
love those.
in short, there was significant overlap in all of these things. So I was a lawyer originally in Chicago, and I went to law school in Chicago, and I practiced as a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. And back then I did some reading and so on, but I was young, and it was the late 90s, and it was boom times for lawyers. And so I really focused on that. And then I moved back to Indiana, where I live now, where I'm from originally. And I like being a lawyer, but I really wanted to be rich. That's really my main goal in life, historically. By historically, I mean in my own life. I like money, and money's good. Money gives you independence, the ability to do things.
Yeah.
And being a lawyer, M&A lawyer, can be quite well paid, but doesn't make you rich. It's a myth. Well, the old joke, or it's not even a joke, that everyone thinks that rich people are people who make a little bit more than they do. So
Yeah.
you can make a very good living as a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, but as a profession, it's gone downhill in terms of security and a wide variety of other things. And I don't like other people telling me what to do. And the nature of being a lawyer who bills out at $800 an hour is that people tell you what to do, because he who pays the he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so it was fine. I like being a lawyer, but I'd rather be rich. And so I started this business from scratch, with no customers. Just decided I was going to have a contract manufacturing business in personal care, mostly hair care. Why I did that is not clear. It's kind of insane in retrospect. I just decided to take my income to zero, with my wife pregnant with our second child, and no customers, no background in the business, bought a few assets from a defunct company, and decided this would what I was going to do. It just seems completely crazy in retrospect. Nonetheless, I did that for just over 10 years, and it was very successful. And I started maybe 4 or 5 years ago writing book reviews as well. I mean, I write book reviews, but of course, the book reviews are mostly a vehicle for me ranting about my own thoughts. So sometimes people say book reviews. I mean, I guess that's interesting, but isn't that something you can read in the New York Times? So my book reviews, of course, are mostly an avenue for me to construct my own political philosophy, and a way for me to remember the books I read, because I have a bad memory. And so I started writing book reviews originally on, I think my first book review I wrote on Goodreads, which is now owned by Amazon. But
Is it? I didn't know that.
it is. Yes, it's owned by Amazon. Well, yeah, Amazon. One of my on my to-do list is to destroy Amazon, just in principle, and also because, as I think I mentioned in that earlier podcast, they deplatformed me as a reviewer. So originally, and then I started doing them on Amazon, and my wife suggested, "Why don't you have your own blog?" And I'm like, "Oh, no one wants to read my stuff, a blog." And finally, she prevailed on me to do it, and wonder of wonders, people decided that they wanted to read my stuff. And so I used that as the central site. And I started, as you said, a year or two ago, adding narrations, the audio versions of the reviews. And it's been very successful. I have a cross-platform across various things. I have a cross-post to YouTube and so on. But only recently have I come out under my own name, because when I was running the business, it was not particularly subject to attack. As a contract manufacturer, no one knows your existence, and customers, my customers, that is or former customers now, which would have been brands, hair care brands, and so on. Didn't really care. Would they have cared if they knew I had a bunch of based opinions on my book review site? Probably not. What they want is, quality product and quality time. And so,
Yeah.
but eventually it might have caused trouble. And so I just used my first name, and now I use my last name. And
You
I sold that
practice an
business.
abundance of caution, as the CDC says.
I did. Not. I don't wear masks, but I don't. I practice that kind of caution. So sold the business. EMEA had grown to a pretty significant size, and we had 150 employees by the end. And so it was a very profitable business. I sold it for, let's put it bluntly, a ton of money. And so now I have a ton of money, and I like having money, in case I haven't mentioned that. And so it allows me to do this openly, though I haven't really changed the degree to which I'm doing this, and explore other opportunities. What those opportunities are, I would tell you, but they're all aborting. I'm not going to run for office or anything like that. Retail politics doesn't interest me, and why run for office? And if you really think the society is a clown society, running for office doesn't exactly fit with that. So
you don't want to be the bearded lady next to the clown.
No, I do not. And so, but I am getting involved in some other local political stuff, some of the school CRT kind of stuff, and other things. So we'll see what the next act is. But I intend to continue writing all the book reviews and other pieces because I enjoy it, and I enjoy all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm in the schools now, but I have a quasi-autonomous role as a substitute teacher long term. So I don't have to do all that stuff. I'm more of a glorified caretaker who facilitates. There's a lot of facilitation going along, but I'm in the transition actually to the tech field. And one of the interesting forms of project management is Scrum. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I love the main document of Scrum talks about this position, which is the product owner, which is equivalent of product managers in other places, but within this framework of project management, they split the roles up. And in the product owner role, it has this one line, which is magic. And it says, the product owner shall not make decisions as a committee. And it's made as an individual. And so in this kind of short overview of your life, it seems, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on the manufacturing end, but it seems like a lot of male-dominated spaces, shall we say, and then a streak of individualism. And I think some of my favorite art, when I've looked back and gone and seen things, it seems to be the work of individuals. And even in, I'm a deacon in the Orthodox Church, and I've had old blog post that I titled, the number one instrument or tool of the devil is committees. I've seen so many good ideas, go to the Sheol or the place of the dead, the Hades, which is committees. And I've even seen this in biblical translations. My two favorite, for example, New Testament translations. One is an Orthodox Christian scholar, David Bentley Hart. The other is the renowned Protestant, but of the high church variety, N.T. Wright. And they have totally opposite opinions on how to do things. David Bentley Hart is very literalist or word for word, and N.T. Wright is very thought for thought. But what I like about both of them is that these individuals translated the Greek themselves. And so the personality sticks out, and there's one kind of cohesive theme or motif throughout. And I don't know the Greek, but I've picked up a few biblical words that are frequent, and I like looking at the kind of transliteration sometime to get a more intimate taste of that. And their books have definitely been that, and I know that in the film space and in the book space as well. So that it's evident there for you as well. I had a very intelligent left-wing guest on Ben, who made the left-wing case against voting for Joe Biden on this program. And it was very, very fascinating when he made that case, because he said he was afraid of the pendulum switch of what would then happen in 2024, which likely, if you thought, what was it? The justice event that you said, the
electoral justice protest.
The electoral justice protest of January 6th, which happens to, by the way, be Christmas Eve in the Orthodox Church worldwide. he said, if that's what you thought was big, or if this, it was actually before that, but in general, if you thought Trump was or 45, they treated him like Voldemort. So if 45 was that bad, what do you think is coming next? And I thought that he was very insightful. So I asked him, what is the main difference that you think between left and right? And I've heard other people give many, many definitions, but one of the things, that key insights I picked up from him was this point. He said, left wing think in terms of systems, and right wing think in terms of individuals. I was reading your review of, what was it? I think I have it up here. The Andrew Roberts book on Napoleon, and you made a similar point about, I think, was it Carlyle who phrased the term the great men view of history?
Yes.
What do you think about this individualist, kind of streak in yourself? I have one of my own, and I could speak about it more in Ethiopia, which is very funny because it also has this communitarian vibe. But what do you think of the great men view of history?
Well, I think quite a few things. We have like 6 topics going, all of which I would love to talk about. David Bentley Hart, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the electoral justice protest, but let's stick with great man and individualism. So not saying that I'm a great man in that sense, but back before we go forward to the entrepreneurship, I think I have a lot of opinions about entrepreneurship. And one of them is, as you say, committees are the tool of the devil. Perhaps not the chief tool of the devil, but the manifestation of the devil within business, small or big. And so a manifestation, I think nowadays there's more manifestations that have raised their head than there used to be. But it used to be that businesses, that was the main problem. So I was always very happy as an entrepreneur because I ran the business, and that was it. It was a complete dictatorship. Everybody liked that. The people and employees tend to like having a dictatorship because they get action. They get decisive action. They get instructions. They get, if there's a choice to be made that an employee doesn't want to make, they can turn to the person in charge to make that decision. Now, of course, they don't want a jerk for the dictator. They want someone who has other beneficial characteristics as well. But that doesn't mean that the best form of government is dictatorship, but it does mean that the most efficient form of government is dictatorship. And that, of course, back to the Romans, is something the Romans realized with their custom of occasional temporary 6-month dictatorships. That is, you have a problem, you pick the right guy, and that guy makes everything better. And then he stops being a dictator. Of course, in the modern world, the problem we've seen in the 20th century is dictatorships have all arisen that don't have any self-limiting feature because they're not within a larger political framework. But when you look at someone like Napoleon was, in fact, to a greater degree than 20th century dictators, within a larger framework. Admittedly, he made a bunch of that framework himself, and it was a very confused time, obviously, after the revolution and with war everywhere in Europe. So I don't want to overstate the framework, but and this also relates to my theory of Augustan government. That is, in order to move to a new and better system, you tend to have to go through a period of dictatorship where some person is in charge. That doesn't mean that person is unlimited. That's another important thing. A dictator is not someone who is not at all subject to the rule of law. It's entirely possible to have someone who is a dictator who is nonetheless subject to the rule of law, whether that's some kind of statute or constitutional law or simply the law of custom. That is, if you don't behave in certain ways because that's not the way you behave. And dictators historically are, in fact, subject to that. But historically speaking, that's mostly of what drives history. So I'm not an expert on Carlyle, certainly, but to the extent people refer colloquially to the great man theory as the engine for most important social change, I would strongly endorse that, with the only caveat being technology nowadays and its uncertain future applications and impact probably modify that to some degree. That is, in the past, it was probably easier for one person to take action in a way that was linear. Nowadays, technology allows one person, as we saw with Donald Trump, to maximize his reach, but it also allows that person to be undercut. So I don't know what the future is going to hold with respect to that, but I do think that to the extent the next, as I like to say, when history returns, it's going to revolve around a great man. And Trump doesn't count as a great man, just for the record. I mean, Trump is a symptom of the clown show, not the savior who was untimely toppled from his righteous perch. I mean, I was all for Trump relative to Joe Biden, but I'm not. I don't think Trump is coming to save us all, past, present, or future.
Yeah, I whenever I thought of him, I grew up watching WWF with transition to WWE. I think of my sweet mother who came across a video someone posted of him, like shaving Vince McMahon's head and like fake punching someone on the ground. And she's like, "Oh my God, is this barbarian going to be the president?" And in my head, I was like, wow, like this man knows kayfabe. This man, however much people, you could disagree with his policies, you can disagree with his aesthetic. One thing you just should not do is think of him as this like really dumb person. Like you can disagree as vociferously as you want on any issue, but there is some level, even if it's not, IQ, it's EQ. Like there's some emotional intelligence that he has. He knows how to read a crowd. He knows how to adapt and do those things. And I always think back to one of my favorite writers, H.L. Mencken, and saying like, one day the Americans will get the Philistines, who we used to call us Americans, would get someone they deserved in the office that really showed them who they are and what they look like. And it was an experience.
It wasn't Mencken who said democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a similar theme. He revisited that a lot. Yeah.
Same.
He was an elitist as well.
Yeah. So I mean, I want to. People have talked ad nauseum about Trump, and I'm happy to talk about Trump. I don't want to necessarily maunder on about Trump, but his lack of ability to judge character in the people around him is fatal. And so being a great man involves a variety of personality traits, but it necessarily involves being able to choose people and inspire who will help you and inspire loyalty in those people. And Trump was able to read a crowd, but you can't translate that into power without having additional people helping you out. And he just, for whatever reason, seemed unable to do that.
I agree with that. Under that kind of analysis, that if the left wing is systems and the right wing is individual, I've always found myself roughly in the center of that, leaning one way or another in different periods of my life. I think certainly more towards individuals now, but always with the thought of what you said, that it needs a system. The greatest kind of individualist in the woods isn't going to do anything. The kind of foundational building blocks of civilization and society require that delegation that you speak of. You have to be able to, even if you can do one task greater than another person, if you can trust them to do that task at least competently, if not excellently, it allows you to be more productive and do your things, which I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir there in regards to your successful business that you were able to sell. I know it's a different note now, and we did kind of go all over the place. There's a quasi structure here, but your ears perked up when I say David Bentley Hart. I have mixed feelings about his works as well, so I'm curious what about him stood out to you.
Well, as you may or may not know, it appears on my blog, but a lot appears on my blog. So we converted to Eastern Orthodoxy 2 years ago. So
I did not know that. Sorry, I didn't know that.
No, not at all. So we attended Greek Orthodox Church, but you're Oriental Orthodox, which is obviously very. There's obviously some minor doctrine. What to the modern era minor doctrinal differences of no great import. So I have great admiration for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, because it's, as I understand, and you're a deacon, as I understand, it's very rigorous in its theology and practice and so on. And I'm sure there's a range of practice, and like there is in any church. But I have great admiration for the Oriental Orthodox. There's a Coptic church down the road from me, and so on. So I was exposed to Hart maybe 10 years ago, when I knew he's an Eastern Orthodox theologian, and I read several of his books. And I used to like him quite a bit. I liked his book, The Experience of God, which talks about God as not so much in a Christian context, but in a atheist versus non-atheist context, like what the logical arguments are for God that understates it. It's a very good book. I have a review of it. But he wrote a book which I was actually interested in about universalism. So which came out recently, which I have a copy of, but I did not read, and was viciously panned across the kind of theological spectrum. Hart seems to have gone off into the weeds. Basically, he's always been kind of acerbic to people who disagree with him.
Yeah.
But he wrote this book, and like, I'd like to believe that universalism is true. It's above my pay grade to decide whether God lets everyone into heaven or not. Not my concern. But his rejection of all prior Christian theology that admits of the existence of hell and the possibility of people, and the likelihood, in fact, of people going to hell, as it's very kind of a leftist turn, as far as I can tell. And he's also aligned himself with, as I understand it, with leftist economic doctrines, which again, I have a fair bit of sympathy for. Like, I'm not a Chamber of Commerce guy. I see a lot of value in certain socialistic light kind of things, distributism and so on. And then he was like praising various other left-wing figures. So you may know more about it. I'm curious why you are kind of mixed mind about him, but my opinion of him is kind of sunk in recent years.
Yeah, so the only book of his that I've read, and I have the audio version of, is his New Testament translation. So I haven't read any of his major books, but I'm very familiar with the subject of apostasis, which is that all should be saved, or that all shall be saved. And I have not read the book, but I know what he's doing. And it's one of those things where you push yourself to read things that go against your grain, if you're that type of a person, and I certainly am. But there's just certain things I'm not going to read a text on the flat Earth theory. I'm not interested in that. And apostasis is that for me. My great teacher, actually, I have another podcast which is actually Bible focused only, and I'm in a network of about 6 different Orthodox priests, and then I'm the deacon, and all the other Orthodox priests, they're all in your communion, in the Eastern Orthodox or the Greek communion. And my great teacher there is Father Paul Nadim Tarazi, who he has the flagship program there, Tarazi Tuesdays, a part of the Bible is literature, and he has made it very plain, which is that anyone, not just David Bentley Hart, but anyone who makes these arguments, what they're really doing is 2 things. The one thing that they're doing is so that they can do the second thing. The first thing that they're doing is that they're undermining the role or the function of God as the judge of all. So if God or our Lord Jesus is truly the judge, it means we have 3 possibilities for Judgment Day. The one is that he damns everyone. The second is mixed, that he damns some and saves some. And the third is that he saves all. And the fundamental, and you know this as someone who's been in the court, so this analogy is great for you. The fundamental role of a judgment means a decision. And I've studied arbitration, so I know this well in terms of arbitral awards as well. An arbitral award or a judgment is a decision that is enforced. Now, he doesn't need the scores of the bodiless hosts to enforce his decision. He enforces it himself there, but he allows them to participate in that enforcement. And so saying that it's only one of these 3 possibilities is saying that DBH or someone else is in fact the judge of all creation rather than God. And so this bleeds into the second aspect of it, which is to say the reason why someone would do that, the underlying reason, is because they want to make sure that they will be saved. And so it's really a narcissistic reason. And I'll beat upon him on just one more thing, and then I'll praise him. I'll say what I praise about him. He's pointing to actual ancients who are historic figures, who have the much misaligned or maligned Assyrian Church of the East, which has been called the Nestorian Church by many, and I don't think that's accurate, although they do have Nestorius in their diptychs, and that's another kind of rabbit hole we could go down at another time. But from the Assyrian Church of the East, he looks at the figure of Saint Isaac, who is respected and venerated in the Eastern Orthodox Church, even though he's a figure from the 700s, and his church only accepts the 2 councils, whereas the Eastern Orthodox accepts 7 and the Oriental Orthodox accept 3. So they only accept 2 councils, and yet he's considered a saint even in our communions. This is a fascinating figure that his writings, that I think many of them are very mystical and beautiful, but I think one heretical or poor teaching, false teaching that he had was this teaching that all should be saved. Another figure he looks at is one of the Gregories. I get them confused, but probably of Nazianzus, I think, one of the Cappadocian fathers, also believed that all should be saved. And then if you look at Origen, who's also this complex figure, I think he's officially excommunicated after his death, post-mortem, with your communion. But in my communion, I don't know if anyone's officially excommunicated him, but he's like not a saint, but he's the father of scripture. Origen of Alexandria occupies this very weird space as well. And so those are three ancient figures, especially Origen, the most ancient, late antiquity for Isaac, and you have the Cappadocian father, that all have this idea. So he's pointing to actual patristics. So what I appreciate about him is it's not just emanating from some new Protestant sect that he's trying to form, but he's doing this within the actual writings of the patristics of the fathers. So I'm impressed with that. Number two, when I read his New Testament translation, I appreciate that he goes to preserve the idiomatic language of the Bible by doing his translation. He's got me running to the dictionary, and my English is not too shabby, but he's got me running to the dictionary so often. So for me, like reading his works, even when he's talking about like defending outright state socialism or communism, he does it in a beautiful way. Like you said, he's acerbic and acidic towards his enemies. And so I just learn about the English language when I read his politics I disagree with, and I certainly learn about theology when I read his New Testament. So I'll end on that good note.
I think the universalism, apox, is, how do you pronounce it?
I think it's apocastasis, but again, I'm not a Greek guy.
He, as you say, it's narcissistic, and there is in fact a tradition, as you say, patristically, and later on, of theologians who are willing to countenance universalism and discuss universalism. And I have a review of a book by a Russian metropolitan, Hilarion Alfeyev, Christ the Conqueror of Hell, where he discusses this. And I think he's kind of leans toward this.
I love him.
But
he has a book on St. Isaac, by the way.
I should get that book. I will get that book right after we're done here. And so, but where Bentley Hart goes wrong is that he, again, I haven't read the book, I've skimmed it, and I've read these reviews, is that he, as you say, announces that he has now decided that there is only one right answer, and the discussion time is over. I mean, which of course is, as you say, narcissistic.
That's very right, and that is the thrust of that line of argument. So that was a pleasant surprise that you had looked into that too. That really expands the range of thought that you've covered. You said you don't know a lot about Ethiopia, but I was blown away by your review of the Throne of Adulis. And why I bring that up, for those who don't know, Adulis is this now closed ancient port. It's in modern day Eritrea, which was of course a part of Greater Ethiopia, which was before that Aksum. And that book has things to say about that as well. It was several weeks ago, a good friend of mine and another deacon, he's a student at the Catholic University of America, he was reading that for his research. And he was reading passages to me about it. And then after you and I corresponded and I read your review and you told me about the fact that you had written that, I told him. And so he read some more passages to me last night. And so I'm definitely going to have to go by and read that book now without rehashing your entire review, because we'll point people to Worthy House so that they can go read it. And I'll link to it in the show notes. How did that book catch your attention initially? And then, what is it that you have to say about it?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not sure, honestly, how I ran across that book. I have a particular interest in medieval and classical history. So if you ask me what happened in, for example, British history in the 1700s, I may know a little bit, but I probably know a lot more what happened in the 1300s, which is perhaps less useful, but I find it more interesting. And so the late antiquity is not an area that I have great expertise in. I find it very interesting. It's also an area where obviously the historical records are very spotty, whether you're talking the Horn of Africa or you're talking even areas that were closer to the center of the Roman Empire. So I don't know where I ran across that book. The author, G.W. Bowersock, has written a ton of different books. I mean, he must be pushing 90 now if he's still alive.
Incredible.
So I maintain a very long wish list of books on Amazon. I hate Amazon, but I use their wish list. Though I tried to buy my books off Amazon whenever possible, but they have a handy wish list feature. So, and I own 8,000 books. I mean, on my way to 20,000 is my goal.
Wow.
So
physical or ebooks?
Physical.
Wow.
I went through, my wife and I both went through an ebook phase several years ago, and then I decided I hated ebooks. So it's all physical. I very occasionally, the only use I would make of ebooks is that you run into books occasionally that a physical copy is simply unavailable or costs $800, and you can get an ebook for $2. So
yeah,
I may be rich,
and you could print it.
Rich.
Yeah. Right. You could go to Google Books and print those books out.
Yeah, and so I like having well-bound physical copies, but I'm not. Occasionally, I will use an ebook. So, I don't know why exactly I picked that book, but it's really one of my favorite books of the past couple of years because it really expanded my own knowledge of a historically crucial area of the civilized world about which almost nothing is known nowadays. I mean, your average person has no idea what happened in that whole area. They lump it in with, Ghana or someplace, right? I mean, most Americans have no idea what goes on in that area of the world. And to the extent they do, and they don't lump it in with Ghana, they think of, Muhammad or Saudi Arabia or something, which, is irrelevant for these purposes and was irrelevant until much later on or somewhat later on in history. So the Bowersock does a great job of explaining that time of history and what was happening through what I understand to be very limited sources. It's possible, for example, I'm not an expert, that he states as fact things which other academics might disagree with. So I don't really know. I don't have an opinion as to whether he's 100% accurate in the sense of there are no doubt historical controversies. That's what academic journals are for when they're not busy, when they're not talking about intersectionality nowadays. They presumably argue about obscure historical contingencies. But I found it to be extremely interesting because it taught me something about that area, as well as gave me insight into the way that Islam developed. As I say at the end of the review, Islam, people who are Muslim apologists will frequently say, well, Muhammad came up with this revelation, and how could he have come up with it because he was in this backward desert-dwelling polytheistic area, when in reality all the powers in that area were monotheist, and that's where a lot of the theology that Muhammad put into his new religion came from. It was an area that was highly civilized with powerful nations and then powerful patron nations of those, all of them monotheistic. Something that's completely lost in the modern world. So that's some of the stuff I talk about in my review.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's like a sort of Jewish Christian amalgamation with some new stuff in it. And you're right. It's very much a part of the milieu. It doesn't mean that there were zero pagans at the time. Certainly there was still that, and probably there was a lot of syncretism. To your point on some of the obscure points, one of the passages. It's very funny, again, if you look at it from the politics of now, that my friend was reading to me, that someone may disagree, like what you're saying with Bowersock. It's like you have one inscription in Greek, and you have inscriptions in Ge'ez, which is our Semitic language, our ancient Semitic language, as well as in Greek. And a lot of the coinage, for example, at the time, because Greek was a lingua franca, due to Alexander the Great, I know another figure you appreciate, that Hellenized so much of the known world, just the way that Ethiopians would speak English as a second language now, many of them spoke Greek. And still, like you said, the fullness of what that means and why is not very clear. I'm going to reach out to some biologists soon, because I read some papers recently from them that said, there is a quote unquote non-African component to most Ethiopians, especially the northern ones of which I'm a part. And they don't know quite what that is. And a lot of the British anthropologists of the 20th century thought, it's got to be Yemenites because the Yemen is right there. But actually, when the genetic DNA of 2019 is being analyzed, the two groups they found that were most similar, and there are many other groups that are more loosely similar, were Tunisian Jews, and especially the ones that were not mixed as much with the Sephardic ones that came over. And then the Minoan civilization from the island of Crete. And I don't even know what that means, but those are two different groups, And I know with the Minoans, it's funny because obviously they enter into Greek history at some point, but apparently even their writing has yet to be deciphered. And there's a debate whether it's Indo-European or is it Semitic. And, with the connection of the Tunisian Jews and with us who speak his language, I'm no scholar of that, but it's probably not a bad guess to say that it was some type of Semitic language there before the Bronze Age collapse, and a lot of the civilizations in that that period kind of went the way of the dodo. But there's Ptolemy III, who is this Greco-Egyptian great man who has one of these inscriptions in the book, and there's another one where it's unnamed, and so people could only make guesses. And some scholars, I think like Bowersaw, could guess that too was someone from a Ptolemaic dynasty. But the second one, the Ptolemaic one, is from 200 BC. The latter one is around 100 AD, which is around the time of the rise of Aksum. And so the funny thing about cultural appropriation, when you think about it, is that who we know as the Kushites, which, Kushite in general is this language group that groups many people, including Ethiopians, but particularly the area of modern day Sudan, the area between the various ebbs and flows of the great empires of Egypt and Ethiopia. Those are the people that were in the most technical sense. In a loose sense, Ethiopian means dark skinned, so it could be any African that the Herodotus and the Greeks are writing about. But in a technical sense, the Ethiopians are those Nubians or those Kushites who were between Egypt and modern day Ethiopia or Aksum. And so this Aksumite king, who's pagan, it's a couple centuries before Aksum becomes Christian, is talking about all of his conquests. And one of the people that he conquered are the Ethiopians. And then after that, he culturally appropriates their name. And then for a majority of history, we start calling ourselves Ethiopia because the word Ethiopia is in the New Testament and in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. So it's easy to see yourself there. It doesn't say the Aksumites, it says the Ethiopians. And so it's this very funny thing. And I know you touched upon that in your review as well, but that's one of those areas that I think that book is so fascinating. So I appreciate, however you serendipitously came across it, I appreciate that you did.
Oh, it's a great book. My fear is that it's very expensive now. And I actually, this is something I've complained about in my reviews, that book prices for used books have exploded in the past 2 years. It used to be you could get almost any used book on Amazon for like $2 plus $3.99 shipping. But now books are regularly $30, $40, $50. And I actually remember waiting till I could get that book for a decent price because, a print run for a book like that is what? I mean, trivial, probably 1,000, 5,000. I mean, even though it's semi-popular in the sense that it's not a academic monograph, it's clearly a relatively limited market for a book like that. And so, I recommend these books to people, and I guess they can always read the ebook, but even the ebooks are 20, 30 bucks. And so I really think it's kind of a tragedy that a lot of books are so expensive. And sure, I mean, if you don't read that much, you can save up your pennies or get your stimulus check and buy it. But occasionally people say, well, you reviewed this book and now it's only available for $150. I'm like, well, can't help you there. I'm not sending out free copies. But it is sad that you can buy whatever, some has-been politician's book for $12.99 at Barnes and Noble, but a real book costs you $50. That's just a tragedy.
It is. And these elements in our society of like elitism versus believing in the masses, I've leaned more and more into the elitism, but at least the type of elite that wants to generously outreach to the masses to see who amongst the masses could be included in and entered into the elite, so that being an elite is not a closed gate that someone's a gatekeeper of, but really trying to invite and promote people to do that. So I'm always trying to, part of the reason for the existence of my channel is like Americana and Ethiopian studies, and getting people more and more proud, more and more interested, so that they could reach out and study these things, whether it's, your entrepreneurial acumen that could teach people how to save money so that they could afford these books, or your experience in reading. As we close out, do you have any closing thoughts or words of encouragement or advice to, because I've had ebbs and flows in my own personal reading practice. There are times where I'll go through 1 to 2 books in a week or two, and then I might take a few months off. Is there any sort of advice you have to get people to be more vociferous readers like you are, and or make some money so that they could have more leisure, so that they become vociferous readers?
Those are two actually essentially unconnected questions. I have lots of thoughts on entrepreneurship. They appear on my blog. If you go, there's a business and money category. So if anyone wants to know my very opinionated thoughts on how one should act as an entrepreneur, you can go and read those.
Excellent. And plug it for them so they know the exact link. I'll throw it in the show notes as well.
It's theworthyhouse.com, and the title comes from the epigraph for Lawrence of Arabia's autobiography, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, though he stole the actual phrase from Proverbs. And so I have lots of opinions on entrepreneurship, like I say. As far as reading goes, I think that you really have to assign yourself the job of reading if you're going to do it at any time when you have other stuff going on. So for example, when I go on vacation, my wife and I have several children. We tend to go on kind of hiking vacations. So it's not like we're going, nowadays, no one goes on vacations where you do tourist stuff, but they're low key, right? We're not spending the whole day, we're not going out to fancy dinners, what have you. So I typically on a vacation will read in a week, 7 books, 10 books, something like that. But that's all I do. But other days when you have stuff, you're taking the kids to school, you're doing stuff, you're working for a living, what have you, you have to say, well, I'm going to sit down. I use a timer. I use a timer clock with a wheel. And so you buy these things that they use them in schools and so on. I say, well, I'm going to read now for the next hour. And so I think if you really want to get reading done, you have to make it an assignment, because there's always something else you can do. You can mow the lawn, you can answer that call, you can check your email. Just don't do that, and then you'll get more reading done.
I like that. I like that you set the bar at an hour in case there are weaker elites out there. There was a Coptic priest that I heard one time said, mandate at least 20 minutes. So we'll aim for a window of 20 minutes to an hour, and hopefully those with ears that hear will hear, and those able to read betwixt and between the lines will be able to do that. Do you have any other closing thoughts? Anything that we didn't touch on that you think the people should hear at home?
I do not. I think that we touched on very many topics that actually I would have liked to go down the road of, learn more about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and so on. But I think the topics we did discuss, we did a reasonable job of covering. So hopefully that'll be valuable for the people who listen to this.
Thank you so much, Charles. And it'll whet their appetite for a part 2, 3, or 4 if you're ever down and willing. Certainly, our arms here are wide open.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.